Oh, YouTube. Well, this sleepy little town in the north center of Missouri was a major crossroads. This road, if you keep going, follow it, it'll take you all the way to California. You go this way, it'll take you all the way to New York. And back in 1858, a Mr. Pershing bought a tiny little general store down there. Wasn't much of a business, but 2 years later, the Civil War broke out, and they built a fort right across from that general store. So that general store became a gold mine for him. And 2 years later, the doctor who had built this house decided to move on and sold it to Mr. Pershing. And I think he bought it shortly after the Civil War. In 1860, he had a son named John. John Pershing was raised in this house. And if you're not sure who John Pershing was, you're probably more familiar with him, knowing him by the nickname they gave him in the military, Blackjack Pershing, the commander of the Allied American Expedition Force in World War I. But there's a lot more to him than just that. So let's take a look. I'm not going to take you inside because you've seen Victorian furniture in some of the other places I've been to. Very little of it. A couple of beds are actually belong to the Pershings and may or may not have been used by John. They are about to jack the house up and put a cellar underneath it, level it up. So it's going to be closed down for a little while, but this is not a well. This is a cistern. The kitchen was inside there. They think when they lift it up, they'll be able to find where it was connected. And this building on the back, or just off the back door, this was the summer kitchen. So get all the heat out of the house. And of course, here's the root cellar just off of it. And probably would have been also used in case of a storm. And the outhouse was way back there, and they used to have hollyhocks around it, so you really didn't see it. And that was a typical thing to do back then, or even today around outhouses. So inside the schoolhouse is a display of high points of Pershing's career. This is the actual schoolhouse that he taught in. It was located 10 miles away, and they moved it here to the grounds of the museum. He basically, he had a teacher certificate, a contract, paid him $30 a month, and a learn or suffer attitude towards teaching. And he had taught at a Negro school, as they called it back then, but with prejudice from both sides that drove him away from that, led him to be teaching here. In 1881, he read in the local paper that there was a competition to be held or test to get a spot at West Point. I wasn't really so much interested in being in the Army or having a career in the Army, but a free education was right up there at the top of his list. So he, with the help of his sister, who was the only one he told about his intentions, he got a 2-week leave of absence from teaching and drilled on the subjects that the exam covered and went and won himself an appointment to West Point. This is him as a young cadet at West Point. I got a nice photograph of his class, the 1886 class, and that gentleman right there is Pershing. Now he was elected to class office each of the years, and on a graduation he had the highest rank of senior captain, and he chose to serve in the cavalry because that was the branch that he thought corralled marvel and mystique. He was sent out west in command of Troop D, the 10th Cavalry, which, in case you don't know, that was the Buffalo Soldiers. So he was commanding a unit that most Caucasians didn't want to command, but they fought against the Sioux, and he actually was in the wars against Geronimo. But the reason that he got the nickname Blackjack Pershing was John Pershing. Sometimes people named John are called Jack, but because he commanded black troops, that's how he got the name Blackjack. And he was okay with that. So when the Spanish-American War broke out, he served with Teddy Roosevelt. Here's Pershing right here, and at San Juan Hill. And his commander, the regimental commander and a Civil War veteran, Colonel Ted Baldwin, in a personal letter acknowledged that Pershing as the coolest and bravest man I ever saw under fire, adding, "You carried out your orders to the letter, no matter where it took you." In 1906, Pershing was serving as an observer in the Russo-Japanese War. He'd been in the Army for 20 years, and he was just a captain. Normal military promotions would come slowly, and normally you'd have to have about 30 years in to march between second lieutenant to colonel. Captain Pershing was able to jump from captain to brigadier general over 862 more senior officers, and so that caused a little bit of a friction. But again, a friend with Teddy Roosevelt, a little political connection can't hurt. Now in the 1914 to 16, we're having trouble along the southern border with Pancho Villa, and Pershing was sent down. There's a picture of him fording a river, and over here is George Patton. So interesting how a lot of those got connected. Here's Pancho Villa down here. They actually met and respected each other and were able to get a sort of a truce for a couple of years, but then Pancho Villa did raid into the States, and Pershing went after him without permission, so he ended up fighting both the Mexican army and Pancho Villa, but was able to successfully complete that. While a lot of this was happening, his wife and 3 daughters were killed. They were in the Presidio out in San Francisco, and the fire burned the house down and killed the 3 of them. His son was the only member of the family to escape that fire. Of course, most of us associate General Pershing with World War I, and when we were headed over there, we had a very small army, and I think there was 174,000 members of our army, very small army. And Pershing went over with originally only a couple hundred men, and the The Allies, the French, the English weren't really super impressed with all that. And it took a while. Training over here, getting our soldiers trained to go over there. And so they wanted the Americans under command of the British and the French generals, and Pershing would not allow that. And he pushed back. And when our finally got our men over there, then they were, here's the Marshal Foch and General Pershing, Marshal Foch of France. So once we finally got over there, then we started to make ourselves really felt with modern equipment and the fresh troops. Remember that the war had been going on for a few years, and the men, the Americans came in, we were all fresh troops, and so definitely made a major difference. And of course, 1918, you had the flu epidemic, and that caused more deaths than the actual war. Some of the troops never made it out of the United States. Some turned right around and came back because they were sick. And so, anyway, you can read more about that. So when the war was over, General Pershing's son Warren, he's right here, he was 9 years old, came over to France. And when, in 1919, when he was on his way back, he received word on the ship that Congress had conferred to him the rank of General of the Armies. The only other person to have held that rank was George Washington. So after the war, papers wanted to know where he stood politically. Being a national hero, they figured he could be president. Got General Washington, General Jackson, General Taylor, General Grant. So there's a history of military heroes becoming president, and he did not go that way. What he did do is he went around preaching military readiness to a largely indifferent public. They wanted to go back. Why do we have a big, huge standing army? He ordered the downside, or he appointed chief of staff at a downsizing and reorganized military, and he passed a lot of that, delegated a lot of that authority. What he mainly focused on was things like the war memorials and the cemeteries. This is what happens to be in France. And Calvin Coolidge sent him to try to mediate between a border dispute between Chile and Peru, and that added up a couple of years of his life and almost ruined his health. And he eventually remarried to an artist, a French artist, and when he married her, it was like 34 years of age difference. But here he is in 1944. He passed away in 1948 on July 15th, and he was 87 years old. So next to the house is a memorial park to the local men who served, and many of which passed away in all the wars. On the other side, these are all World War I on the inside. On the other side are the other wars. Now that's a pretty impressive statue of blackjack Pershing. And with that, I think I will get back on the road and see what else I can find. See you later, YouTube.